Welcome, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. These afternoons are really hosted by the fragrant Margaret Hodge and Julia Allman for the North Yorkshire District Council of the SNU, Spiritualist National Union. And today we're going to look at how spiritualism has diverged between the American experience and the British experience. There are two themes that we need to keep in just a second, Margaret. I'll just do something. There are two themes to this talk, really. And the first one is terribly obvious, in that the United States is a very large country, and Great Britain will fit into California, plus a bit of Oregon, or a bit of Mexico, if you prefer your chilies down there. And the matter of the size of the relative size of these two countries was a surprising influence on how the movements developed. The second theme is, and this is one that researchers really need to get to grips with, really, is that the size of the movements in the two respective countries was actually very similar. So from the 19th century right up to the present, spiritualist organizations in the two countries were very alike in terms of their size. But what I wanted to start with really was 1848. Now, what do we all know about 1848? Well, for the first off, it was a year of revolutions. It was a year of revolutions in Berlin, in Vienna, and in Paris. And these were liberal democratic revolutions, which people took to the streets and the barricades to promote democracy in their societies. And there was also a year of revolutions in Britain, with the Chartist movement having a massive demonstration on Kennington Common. It was one of the first mass photographs ever taken of a demonstration. The United States, Mexico in the United States signed the Peace of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ceded from Mexico all of California and the southwestern states of the United States. Well, what are the United States? And America paid $15 million. Well, everyone likes a bargain, don't they? And in fact, in that year, of course, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Also in 1848, the first women's convention happened in New York State at Seneca Falls. This was a convention of women who wanted to take up the struggle for suffrage and for women's rights. And not 100 miles from Seneca Falls, of course, is Hydesville. For those of you who are not familiar, and I won't belabor this one, spiritualism came about in Hydesville through table rapping with the Fox sisters. Sorry, not table rapping. They developed systems of communication through raps on the walls. And that was likened to the telegraph. The telegraph, as an instrument of communication, had been developed in the 1840s by Morse. And the way the raps occurred, they could use this as an alphabet, was very like the telegraph. And telegraphy was the buzzword of the 1840s. So really, spiritualism was born in a year of revolutions. And we as spiritualists and metaphysicians, whatever your perspective on spirit communication is, would accept that Hydesville was one of the most significant events in human history, and it occurred in a year of revolutions. In 1987, a British historian, Logie Barrow, wrote a book called Radical Spirits, and his model suggested that spiritualism in the 19th century attracted people who were interested in change, who were free thinkers, who could take up what had become a highly unpopular movement even in the 1850s and support it. This spiritualism was particularly attractive to women because spiritualism uniquely empowered women at a time when nothing else in the world did, and it gave women a public platform. And of course, it wasn't ladylike to stand on a platform and be seen by men. It gave women a platform to fight for their spiritual freedoms and their spiritual rights. In this country, just a second, folks, I'm just going to do something with this screen. In this country, women like Emma Hardinge Britten, Alice Hess, Mrs. Steer, Frances Cottrell, all took up the cause of fighting to improve the lot of their fellow human being. And this was seen as an aspect of the brotherhood of man. In the United States, women like Cora Tappan, Lizzie Doughton, Axel Spraggs, and Victoria Woodhull all fought publicly for the abolition of slavery. The movement in Britain was radicalized by the need to improve the lot of the common man and woman. They worked, and the movement coalesced around social issues. The press of the late 19th century debates constantly. This debate went between the Labour Party, socialism, and liberalism. And the spiritualist movement can be seen on the left of centre in the political spectrum. Of course, in the United States, from 1821 onwards, the movement, the whole of society, coalesced around the issue of slavery and the abolition of slavery. And that created what became a broad spectrum of progressive and radical groups that fought for all kinds of issues, but they could all coalesce around the issue of the abolition of slavery. In women like Cora Tappan Richmond, as she's known in the United States, and Lizzie Doughton, whose hymns are in the SNU hymn book, would stand on platforms to give trans discourses in front of mixed crowds of people who were all united by the abolition of slavery. One of the leading spirits of the time was this woman, Victoria Woodhull, 1837 to 1927. Victoria Woodhull encapsulates what a radical woman of the 19th century was in America. She was born, her and her sister, into poverty. Her father was an itinerant salesman of snake medicines, Dr. Do-Good stuff. He probably sold her into prostitution. Victoria Woodhull was a spiritualist medium and a trance medium, and she, like other women of that period, addressed anti-slavery rallies. After the Civil War, she started the first women's stock brokerage on Wall Street, and in 1872, even though she couldn't vote herself, she stood for the presidency of the United States. Victoria Woodhull then met an Englishman called Martin, and the Martins owned Lloyd's Bank, which is still in existence, of course. And she moved from the United States, settled down in rural England, and became Lady of the Manor. And Victoria Woodhull had an expression which was that if you preach the doctrine, you must live the life. And if you look at the British experience of women who campaigned for social reform, Victoria Woodhull and the American spiritualist women and the British spiritualist women were united in that doctrine of if you preach the doctrine, you must live the life. In other words, they lived the brotherhood of man to reform and change the societies that they were in. After the Civil War in America, those broad coalitions parted company, of course, and the different movements went their different ways. Some were united by teetotalism, for example, which became a huge movement in the United States and in Great Britain as well. The women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton separated themselves from the spiritualist women, and the two movements, the women's suffrage, women's feminist movement, and the spiritualist women who would have campaigned for both, actually parted company at that time. There are organizational differences between the United States and Great Britain. As we were saying, one of the themes is that the two countries have a similar sized movement throughout the 170 odd years, but they developed the movements differently. The Great British model, and this was one proposed by Logie Barer and Radical Spirits, was The circle, the home circle, the circle of friends, formed societies. These societies were president, treasurer, and secretary with a committee. Those societies formed churches. The churches formed regional organizations. Here in Yorkshire, I believe the first was the Yorkshire Union of Spiritualists. Those regional organizations formed national organizations. This is the British experience. The first was, of course, the National Federation of Spiritualists in 1890, and the second, which later in 1901 became the Spiritualist National Union. In Britain, a very much smaller country, we have a density of spiritualist organizations in a small area. Take today, for example, in Yorkshire, within 60 miles of where I live, there are 38, I believe, 38 SNU churches, Spiritualist National Union churches, plus at least 6 that I could think of yesterday. So you're talking about 44 churches in a 60-mile radius. So what happened was, organizationally, the president, secretary, treasurer, and their committees invited speakers to work on their platforms. Those speakers then took up the pathway, the routes around these churches, and would tour different churches on different days. So that the churches never developed a pay hierarchy of ministers within them. The network of churches was so dense in certain areas, particularly across the north of England, moving across Lancashire, Merseyside, Manchester, into Pennine, Yorkshire, and beyond. There were so many churches that they could have different speakers every week. And for that reason, those speakers only ever work, and still do, for their expenses. Now, it wasn't the case that mediums didn't earn fees. If you had some unusual ability, then of course the churches or societies in the 19th century would invite speakers to come along and demonstrate their particular spiritual gifts. And there are many examples of mediumship given in my first book, Dead Men's Embers. Those speakers did get fees. In America, organizationally, because the country is so great, because the movement was the same size as that of Great Britain, churches tended to be few and far between. So a medium would become a minister. In America, it's very common for the ministers there to be, the mediums there, the speakers, to be reverends, to be doctors, which is just not the case in Great Britain. So in America, the organizational model was different. It meant that an individual would start a church, form a board, form a trust, and then take on property in common. Those boards, those ministers, then formed regional or statewide organizations. In the United States model, I call it a model because further research is always welcome on these subjects, it was the state organizations rather than national organizations which came to dominate the field. I tell you folks, it's a researcher's nightmare looking into organizations that are now defunct in the United States. Wikipedia lists not less than 27 different organizations that have failed in the United States, which wasn't really the case in Great Britain. In Britain, because the movement only ever paid expenses because of the network of churches that different mediums would go to each week, they only ever paid expenses or occasionally fees for unusual services, unusual mediumship. What occurred was that there evolved from the radical roots that we've looked at an ethos of volunteerism. Now, in common with the United States, all the churches in either country relied on a whole army of volunteers to support the work. But in the United Kingdom, volunteerism became a spiritual aspect of service, which is a part of the brotherhood of man. And you were expected to give your service out of spiritual worth, which was not the case not entirely the case in the United States, where the ministers were salaried individuals. So in Britain, we had a culture of volunteerism, if I can call it that. In fact, our national president, Minister David Bruton, has only in the last 10 years received a salary for being president of the Spiritualist National Union nationally. And of course, that takes the movement forward because it introduces professionalism at that level. And you could say in the American model that having salaried officials at the head of your church actually encouraged professionalism in that field as well. In 1936, I have a copy of the manual and who's who of British spiritualist organizations. We can total up 1,178 organizations within Great Britain. Part of that figure is made up of the Greater World Spiritualist League, and Maurice Barbanel, the editor, in fact, one of the editors and founders of Psychic News, said there were 580 Greater World Spiritualist League churches in their league. So in Britain, 1936, if you were with me on the Ethel Post Parish talk, you'll know that the mid-30s was probably the high point of spiritualism in the United States and in Great Britain. You're looking at in around roughly the region of 1,178 churches in both countries. I have here this magazine. If anybody in the United States has got some, I would be very pleased to hear it. This is Chimes magazine for 1956, and I did a little tally. And Chimes magazine listed 117 churches in California, 117 churches in California. I'll repeat that because I've been to California. And of which 35 churches were in the greater Los Angeles area. So looking at a statewide organization, and Chimes actually reflects a West Coast emphasis, you can see that the movement actually had quite regional strengths there. There were some other difference because the American experience, they had paid ministers to it. The American churches developed a pastoral role, which is not the case quite in Great Britain. The Spiritualist National Union didn't have ministers. I nearly said paid because they're not paid to this day. They didn't have ministers till the 1950s. Whereas in America, the paid minister who ran the church, the medium, had pastoral roles, which meant they cared for the spiritual welfare of their flock. Whereas in Great Britain, the almoner, as it was called, like, hi Julia, almond, and the almoner role was a position on the committee, and the pastoral role was not so prominent. In America, you'd be hatch-matched and dispatched, counseled by your minister. In Britain, it was a little bit, a lot more vague. You could certainly be hatch-matched and dispatched in the national churches, but ministers were not common until from the 1950s onwards. In America, it's quite common to set up churches in stores, as they call them in America, the shops, and also in hotels. Clifford Byers met in the Ansonia Hotel in New York. As I was saying, national organizations in America were fewer and far between. The biggest these days, and historically, was the National Association of Spiritualist Churches. In 2006, I think it was, Wikipedia, which is highly unreliable anyway, listed 144 churches in association to the National Association. It's known as the National in the States. Up to the 1956, the Spiritualist Episcopal Church had over 50 churches in association with it. This is throughout the United States. And there was also nowadays the United Metaphysical Churches based in Roanoke in Virginia, which today has 11 churches in it. The figure of 144 churches, I suspect, is way too high for the National Association of Spiritualist Churches. The churches nowadays, I would think, have approximately the same in Great Britain, the same in the United States, which is a global figure of around 400. A unique feature of the Americans' experience was the summer camps. Now, Britain, as I was saying, is a small country. We don't have that capacity to create summer venues. In the mid-1930s, there was said to be some 35 spiritualist camps. Now, in the British mind, a camp is somewhere you go and you put a tent up with or a marquee. But in fact, what is meant by the camp is a residential community. In America, there's a wonderful book called Cities on a Hill. In America, because there's so much space, communities could come together and live in the ways that they wanted to, and they could socially experiment with different types of communities. For example, the Amish, or retired people, or people who love golf, or people who love bridge, they would come together and they form residential communities, and the spiritualists did the same. The largest was Lilydale in upstate New York, founded in 1879. Chesterfield in Indiana, which was started in 1891. Camp Casadega down in Florida near Orlando, and of course Camp Silver Bell, which was operating from 1932 through to 1989. A lot of churches closed between in the summer months. You know, if you were living in Florida, it's so hot, and a lot of the churches would close for the summer months, and people took their vacations, took their holidays in these summer camps. And the descriptions of the vast numbers of people who went, Peggy Barnes-Jeffs, for example, in the 1960 program for Camp Silver Bell, said that people were sleeping roughly in the lobbies of the hotels. All the hotels and boarding houses in Ephrata in Pennsylvania were full, and hotels throughout the region in the nearby towns were full with visitors who poured in to the summer camps. They were a big money spinner. We come now to the aspects of mediumship, of which the two countries have diversified. The first one I wanted to look at was precipitation. Now, doing some research and made some inquiries, precipitation is where an image materializes onto a canvas, onto a board or paper, whatever it is. In Britain, I can think of only of a man, David Duguid of Glasgow, who in the late 19th century, early 20th century, had this ability. I can think of no other. When I was in San Francisco with my partner some years ago, we took this photograph. Whoops, can you see it? It was on a stairwell in San Francisco, and this is a precipitated painting by Elizabeth and Mary Bang. And the Bang sisters in the late 19th century gave public precipitation demonstrations, sometimes in front of hundreds of people. But I thought that there's a lot on the Bang sisters, so we won't dwell too long on them. But hundreds of people, and sometimes the images were seen to move or the eyes open and close. But I wanted to show you these two. These are modern precipitation paintings, images, by Hoyt Robinett of Camp Chesterfield. Now, the thing about precipitation mediumship is that there are no brushstrokes. You can't see any texture to them. They're all precipitation paintings or images are behind glass, because if you touch them, they smear and they smudge. And likewise, these two. This is William and Lucy, and they were precipitated a couple of years ago at Camp Chesterfield by Hoyt Robinett. Reverend Tom Newman will tell you more about this, but basically you mark your card, the card is layered with pens, with other people's cards, put into a basket. The basket is covered in cloth, and the ink is taken from the middle of the pen. And after this, the medium, Hoyt Robin, gives, I believe, a trance demonstration, and at the end, the package is unwrapped, the lasagna is baked, and these images have appeared on them. So this is William, and this is Lucy. Another form of mediumship which the British don't practice is billet or ballot reading. I think this one has pretty much died out in the United States. I've never seen an example of it, though it was very, very common at one point. The ballot is a small piece of card, a bit like the SNU voting slip. You put a question and your name, or you put a question onto the card, you put that into an envelope, you mark the envelope goes into a basket, and the basket goes up to the platform, and the medium gives a message by psychometrizing. They don't open the envelope, they just hold it in their hands and they give a message. And there are accounts of Ethelpost Parish giving names, addresses, dates of birth, causes of death, and extraordinary levels of evidence are given through ballot reading. But as I say, as far as I'm aware, that has gone out of practice. It's really a form of psychometry, which the British would call it. Another form of mediumship, excuse me, another form of mediumship, which is also now, I believe, extinct, was trumpet in the light. This is a trumpet, folks. And in 1925, a hostile journalist called Virginia Swain wrote the first known account of the mediumship of Ethelpost Parish in the auditorium in August of that year, standing on the platform, Ethel in semi-trance state, 200 or 300 people in front of her, and people would come up from the audience, sit in the chair next to her, and Ethel would place the trumpet to her throat, and the recipient would listen down the tube, and they would have conversations with the departed through the tube. And judging from the remarks written up by Virginia Swain, the voices down the tube were recognized by the sitters. Trumpet in the Light, that one was called. It's, I believe, pretty extinct. Message services in the United States. In the United Kingdom, I was trained by the Spiritualist National Union. Spiritualist National Union teaches you to give three items of evidence, which fixes the identity of the spirit communicator in the mind of the recipient. Then you give the message from the spirit world to the recipient, and then you give one further piece of evidence, and the whole lasts 7.5 minutes, and the entire demonstration lasts 40 minutes. So it's 3, the message, more message, 7.5 minutes. In the United States, it's called a greeting, not a meeting. And the speaker and demonstrator goes round to different recipients, gives them an item of evidence and a message from spirit. It's a greeting, not a meeting. And you're supposed to get round as many people as you possible with that methodology. I've seen it work and I've seen it fail as well. But those who are good at it, it can actually be very effective. Coming on now to the press. The British, small country, big movement, had a national press from the start. You had the Spiritualist by Harrison, you had Light magazine, these are all 19th century magazines, and the Medium and Daybreak, which folded, I think, 1895. Followed by, of course, in that decade, we had Two Worlds. We also had, in 1932, Psychic News was founded. In the United States, the same size movement in a far larger country struggled to have a national impact. And what happened was that they developed the literature is full of defunct magazines from on both sides of the Atlantic. But magazines like this one, Psychic Observer, founded in November of 1939 by Ralph and Juliet Pressing, and it was closely modelled on Psychic Observer in London. The Pressings and Barbanel were close friends, and they knew each other well, and both visited both countries. Prior to this one, the most successful late 19th century, 1889, 1941, was Progressive Thinker out of Chicago. The Progressive Thinker reflected spiritualism around the Great Lakes, say from Iowa through over to the New England, the coast. The Progressive Thinker was a terribly dull magazine. It was column after column after column of closely typed font. When Juliet and Ralph Pressing founded Dale News in the early 1930s, which had more of the Psychic Observer format to it. And what they realized was, and this is still true, that spiritualism is a highly visual movement. It's a movement of images. And of course, the modern world is also a world of images. These two magazines, this one, Psychic Observers and Chimes, both achieved something of a national distribution. This one perhaps slightly more East Coast, this one more West Coast. There are small adverts if you're a researcher out there. It's always the small ads. Never mind the long articles on healings. It's the small ads where the information is. And if any of our American cousins can put me in touch with these magazines, I would be very grateful. Thank you. Where are we going? So we've had a national press from the start. We've looked at differences in mediumship, precipitation, trumpet and the light, ballot reading. The biggest single difference between American spiritualism and British spiritualism in the 20th century was physical mediumship. Tom Newman out in New Mexico introduced me to Sally Hayden von Conter, who was a veteran of the movement born in the 1940s. And she said to me, Gerald, it was all physical. It was all physical, meaning that if you went to a spiritualist service, a seance, you would expect some kind of phenomenon, levitation, apports, direct voice, trumpet and the like, materializations. The difference was that the national organization, the National Association of Spiritualist Churches, from the 1940s onward, similar to the Spiritualist National Union of Great Britain, gradually moved away from physical mediumship. But camps such as Casadega down in Florida, Camp Silver Bell in Pennsylvania, and Chesterfield specialized in physical mediumship. These big camps, let's remember, there were probably 35, 40 camps perhaps. These camps operated residentially throughout the year, had a summer season, as we were saying, hundreds and hundreds of people would visit and take their vacations at these camps. And each of the camps had their own stable of mediums. And for example, in Chesterfield, you had Lula Tabor, Maina Taff, James Lawton, Francis Harwood Darsh, Mabel Riffle. The list just goes on, and it was the same at Camp Silver Bell. They were all physical mediums. Where we're going. Many churches, of course, closed in the summer. The program in 1949 for Camp Silver Bell listed 11 direct voice mediums and 1 materializing medium, Ethel Post Parish. So 11 direct voice mediums. After Ethel's death in 1958, the camp program for 1960 listed 16 physical mediums. The difference was that Ethel was the only medium who would be listed as a physical medium, even though the others were physical mediums of different kinds. Every Saturday, the camp mediums put on an auditorium seance. This was true at Chesterfield, it was true at Camp Silver Bell. And say there would be 3 or 4 during of the Saturday. On occasion, for the last auditorium Saturday in the year of the summer season, all the mediums that had been there would gather and give what was known as a bazaar seance. It was bizarre in the sense of a marketplace. The mediums took their chairs and each in turn demonstrated some aspect of physical mediumship. The number and scale of physical mediumship in America was just extraordinary. There is another aspect of American spiritualism which is different from British spiritualism, is that the Americans listed their spirit guides. This is a list that I have from America, getting to know your spirit guides. There are different types of classification. The British don't classify their spirit guides in the same way. In fact, they don't really classify their spirit guides. So we have angels, we have doorkeepers, who are known also as joy guides and gatekeepers. We have spirit doctors, masters, healing sisters, chemists, Indian guides, and secondary guides. And there are other systems of classification, as I say. The one aspect of the physical movement in the United States was that from 1928 onwards, British spiritualist journalists started visiting America. Now, there'd always been reports sent over from America, and the newspapers throughout the spiritualist world, all over the world, syndicated their articles. And in 1937, Maurice Barbanel toured the camps. And with regard to physical mediumship in the United States, he said, US mediums lead the world. The US mediums lead the world. It's great mediums with their regularly impressive phenomena. And Maurice Barbanel wrote, public mediumship in America is superior to that in England, but there are not many home circles. The highest standard of evidence too is higher, but generally speaking, spiritualism is much more commercialized. He went on to say that spiritualism in America tended to be fortune telling and was commercialized. Yet in many other respects, English spiritualism was superior. And he wrote that he missed the spirit teachers, the red clouds, white hawks, white eagles, and silver birches, which of course was his medium. He wrote that America has mediums, but we have teachers. This view that American spiritualism has always been a lot more commercialized than British spiritualism, that physical phenomena was far more extensive in America than it ever was here. I mean, many of you know this topic as well as I do. I think I could count something like 15 physical mediums in Great Britain, say from the late 1930s of the time of John Sloan up to the present. I can't even begin to count the number of physical mediums in the United States. It was just simply extraordinary. Maurice Barbanel wrote, the phenomenal standard of your public demonstrations has amazed me. I thought that English mediums had reached the summit in their ability to deliver unchallengeable evidence of survival. But the psychic displays given in your auditorium are more striking than anything I've seen in other countries. I have quite a few copies of this newspaper, and do let me know if you've got some to spare there, folks. And the papers are just full of accounts of different physical mediumship in the United States. One of the most remarkable occurred in 1936 when Maina Taffy, with the widow of Arthur Conan Doyle, took a flight over New York City, and she gave an independent direct voice seance above the city of New York. One of the journalists who visited America was Hanan Swaffer. He did on a number of occasions. In 1933, he wrote of Ethel Post Parish, 44 materializations at one seance. Ethel Post Parish was a uniquely gifted medium for many reasons. Her particular gift was that she could have multiple spirit manifestations visiting with their loved ones at any one time, 3 or 4, let's say. And when you add them all together, Hanan Swaffer came to the conclusion with Silver Bell, Ethel Post Parish's guide, that there had been 44 materialization materialized spirits visiting. She demonstrated physical medium from 1928 to her death in 1958. At one seance, Hanan Swaffer was asked to come up to the cabinet, and there he met his sister-in-law, Lottie, she was called. Lottie had very long hair. It was so long that she could sit on it. And at that seance on that day, she demonstrated that it was truly her by having a chair brought out to her, and she sat on her hair. Hanan Swaffer was the witness in front of many other people. Another occasion, quite a well-known one, that Silver Bell's father, Chief Bacon Ryan, materialized and asked permission, of course, as you would, to pick up Ethel Post Parish and carry the entranced medium in his materialized arms around the seance. This occurred in 1943. There are many wonderful accounts of Ethel Post Parish's mediumship, and this book is now in production and will be on print and demand. Ethel Post Parish Mediumship in America, and that will be coming out in the next month or so. Ethel Post Parish was not simply a great medium, she was also a cracking good businesswoman. Well, we're coming to the end of our talk today, and I wanted to just, by way of conclude, oh, sorry, I missed something. So what happened? Where have all these wonderful mediums gone? Well, generations come along and generations die off. The latter generation, people, Tom will know, Clifford Byas, Gladys Strone, William Donnelly, Warren Smith, they all passed away. Bertha Ekerode, Lula Tabor, they all passed away in more recent years, in the 30 years ago. And that generation does appear to have been the last, with a few exceptions. There are, say, maybe 4 or 5 genuine physical mediums left in the world today. It's a dying skill. One of the things that really was very damaging to the movement as a whole in both countries was the Mabel Riffle scandal of 1960. Mabel Riffle, as they say in Mikado, was as tough as a bone with a will of her own. She was general manager and secretary of Camp Chesterfield, the Indiana Spiritualist Association Center at Chesterfield, from 1908 to 1960. And she came to dominate the camp. Now, there was no doubt that at one time, Edith Stilwell, her accomplice, and Mabel Riffle were fine mediums, and there are many accounts of her fine evidential direct voice sittings of both mediums. In 1960, Edith Stilwell and Mabel Riffle gave permission to Tom O'Neill to film in a seance in infrared light at Chesterfield. Well, fortunately, there was absolutely no doubt whatsoever that it was fraud. And from behind the cabinet could be seen the figures in drapes coming out, imitating the mediums. Sincere spiritualist as Tom O'Neill was, he had to print the exposure. And it did irreparable damage to the spiritualist movement. It went viral, as we now say. It nearly caused the bankruptcy of Psychic Observer, which he was the editor. Many churches folded. Many churches, of course, ditched the newspaper, I'm afraid. and the movement suffered irreparable damage to its reputation from that time onwards. The magazine itself nearly went into bankruptcy. In 1969, it merged with Chimes, and it ran till 1981. Unfortunately, it all went into runes and crystals and similar such things that don't really belong there. So we're coming to the end of our talk, and thank you for watching. The movements have diverged. It's one language, two worlds, as I said, as a subtitle there. We saw that spiritualism was born in a year of revolutions, and that the movement itself on both sides of the Atlantic partook of that radicalism because it empowered women uniquely in a way that no other movement did. We saw that in the United Kingdom, that the structural organizations developed along different lines. The circle, the society, the church, the region, the national organizations, and that the density of network of churches in Great Britain gave rise to a culture of service underwritten by the Brotherhood of Man, whereby mediums travel from one church to another, giving different services on different days. In the United States, because of the relative size of the country, ministers founded churches, founded boards, founded state organizations. National organizations tended to fracture and fall apart, with the exception of the National Association of Spiritualist Churches and a few others. The ethos in America has always been professionalism and the payment of salaries. Maurice Barbanel and other writers that we've seen thought that this led to commercialization of mediumship and fortune telling. There we are. Nowadays, I would estimate both movements in both countries have something like 400 churches attached to them, and societies and psychical research groups. The different forms of mediumship are practiced in the United States: precipitation, ballot reading, trumpet and the light. I wish we could see a bit of trumpet and the light nowadays. And the way the American spiritualists classify their guides is quite different from the British. The national press in Britain has had a fairly coherent, not the right word, has had a national impact because of the size of the movement and because of the size of the country. That was not quite the case in the United States, where truly national newspapers, even on the conventional press, are relatively unknown. Physical mediumship in the United States was extraordinary compared to Great Britain. British mediumship has focused on mental mediumship, and we've had some wonderful physical mediumship in Great Britain, but nothing to the extent that it was in the United States. Well, I think that's it, folks. That's the differences.